for that video and for the phenomenal work you all do to share these stories with the world. We are really indebted to all of your work. As people are processing that, I also just wanted to have a few other reminders. So we are lucky enough to have C-SPAN here and filming. There are other potentially some journalists that might be joining us. So people should consider that things being said here are very much on the record and be aware that media is in attendance. We are going to be taking questions from the audience in the room. Sorry, folks watching online. And we have note cards on your chairs. So as we have our panels, and if there's any questions you do have, please feel free to write them down. Our phenomenal staff will be here to collect them. And without further ado, I am going to introduce our moderator for our very first panel, Melissa Park from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and who I just found out is a fellow Aussie, and very excited about that. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oops. Aussie exuberance. As you heard, I'm Melissa Park, the Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Welcome to Panel 1 on the toxic and radioactive legacy of nuclear use, production and testing. And I'll just add 80 years of harm. We're going to hear from three amazing panellists who I'll introduce in just a moment. As you've just heard, though, we will be taking questions after they've each spoken, questions that you can write on these little cards, and then they'll get passed to me. I wanted to just acknowledge Sarah. Thank you for doing that acknowledgement of country. This is something that we do in Australia to acknowledge the Indigenous stewardship of the land that's been there for tens of thousands of years, and to pay tribute to that stewardship, that gentle stewardship, and the Indigenous knowledge that is about the interconnectedness of people and the environment, and how that informs that what we do to nature and to each other. Ultimately, we do to ourselves, and we can learn a lot from our Indigenous communities. So the 80-year anniversary of the invention and first use of nuclear weapons is not just an artefact of history. It's an opportunity to reflect on the ongoing brutal impact of nuclear weapons on people and environments that started here in the United States. Before the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it bombed its own soil, its own people in New Mexico. As ICANN and the Nuclear Truth Project and the Marshallese Education Initiative and other groups will be in New Mexico next week to commemorate that first nuclear weapons detonation known as Trinity on July 16 in New Mexico. And as we do that, we'll be among Indigenous and other local communities directly impacted by Trinity, who still bear the intergenerational harm to their health and environments. And of course, Trinity was just the beginning. Trinity led to the US nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 250,000 people. Those bombs would today be described as tactical nuclear weapons. Contrary to popular belief, those bombs did not end the war in Japan. As contemporary records from Japanese generals show, the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan on the August 8th was the actual reason Japan surrendered. Trinity was also the first of more than 2,000 nuclear weapons detonated around the world as so-called tests, from the Marshall Islands to Nevada to Kazakhstan, from Algeria to Australia and the Pacific Islands. Millions of people and their environments have suffered and continue to suffer from nuclear weapons use, production, testing, and as well as nuclear waste. And in large part, they continue to be denied information, acknowledgement, compensation, or environmental remediation by nuclear weapons states, while those same states spend $100 billion per year upgrading their nuclear arsenals. Today, we have two representatives of communities with first-hand knowledge of the impact of nuclear weapons. Mary Dixon American downwinder and award-winning author and playwright. We have Benedict Madison of the Marshallese Education Project to talk about toxic and radioactive legacy in that community that is caused from nuclear weapons. And we'll also hear from Dr. Arjun Makhijani, a nuclear engineer who is president of the anti-nuclear organisation, the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. Dr. Makhijani has authored so many books on global health and the environmental effects of nuclear weapons production. And so I'm just looking to our hosts here. Do we want everybody to come up at the same time? Would you please come up the front? Thank you. You're going to come up here? Okay. So, Mary, can you tell us about your story as a downwinder and about the impacts on neighbouring states and communities from US nuclear weapons testing in Nevada? And I understand there were 928 such tests.
That's right. There were 928 tests in our own backyard, on our own soil, 100 of those above ground, 828 below ground. They lasted from 1951 to 1992. And I always say a war does not have to be declared for it to have casualties. When I think of the hundreds of thousands of people who were harmed by nuclear weapons production, by the storage of the waste at sites across the country, and by those 928 tests in Nevada, the human toll is absolutely catastrophic. I don't even call them tests. They were detonations of actual bombs, far more powerful than those that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I am one of those casualties. I'm what we call a downwinder. I'm from Salt Lake City. I had thyroid cancer, but I saw my family, my childhood neighborhood, and communities across this country absolutely devastated by what those bombs did to us. As children growing up in Salt Lake City, we did what kids do. We played in the snow. We put sugar and vanilla in it and ate it, pretending it was ice cream. We ate vegetables from the garden, and we drank milk that was delivered every morning to our doorstep from a local dairy. How were any of us to know that a silent poison was threading its way through our bodies when a government we trusted constantly and repeatedly told us there is no danger and actually gave us pamphlets saying a lot of people are hearing about Geiger counters going crazy these days. Don't let it bother you. All while those bombs were being exploded in Nevada. And like thousands of communities across this country, we lived under those deadly radioactive fallout clouds. Moving them, I have to tell you, when they moved them underground, it didn't necessarily make them safer. A lot of those broke through the Earth's crust and spewed radioactive material miles into the atmosphere, where it was carried across this country. I just want to show you this. Was an underground test called Sedan, the dirtiest one that they ever did. It was a hydrogen bomb in Nevada. And the winds, which meteorologists warned, go from the west to the east in this country, and they said it would be carried across the entire country. They were ignored, and those tests went on, and it was carried across the entire country. I always show this map that shows where it went. This was based on government data. They only put a dot on here for 3 tests. There were 928. I always have to show those. And when those particles, I don't have to tell you this, when they collided with rain or snow, that's what brought them to the ground. That's where it went into the ecosystem, into the food chain, and ultimately into our bodies. I had a reporter ask me, which test got you? And I just said, which test didn't? I was in my late 20s when I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. They removed my thyroid, surrounding lymph nodes. Then they gave me what they called a radioactive cocktail to drink. They warned me before I was discharged that I should not be around pregnant women or young children, and I shouldn't try to get pregnant for a year. And I remembered that when they did a scan, I watched it on the screen and my ovaries lit up. Well, years later, I had to have a hysterectomy, so I never could have children. I've had other health problems. Luckily, I'm still here. But I think about the people I've lost. My older sister wasn't as lucky as I was. She died when she was 46. She left 3 children behind. I grew up in a neighborhood where it just seemed like cancer was the thing everyone got. I counted 54 people in my childhood neighborhood in Salt Lake City who had cancer, tumors, autoimmune disorders, who suffered infertility, had miscarriages, gave birth to children with birth defects. I had a grade school friend. She died when we were 10 of a brain tumor. 4 weeks later, her 4-year-old brother died of testicular cancer. And at the time, their devastated mother asked her pediatrician if it was some connection that 10 other people in our neighborhood also had brain tumors. The casualties, though, aren't over. They continue to mount. My younger sister has a form of intestinal cancer that she told me just last Friday has spread to her brain, her breast, and her bladder. The casualties just never stop. I worked with so many people in Utah on this issue. All of them have died. I'm the only one still living. And one of them, before she died of multiple cancers, she always liked to say, we're veterans of the Cold War, only we never enlisted, and no one will fold a flag over our coffins. I think that devastating legacy has not ended. People are still being diagnosed. Their cancers return. They develop all sorts of health complications. Then there are the crippling medical bills that have bankrupted many. And I have to say, the psychological damage, like our scars, run deep. I will never stop feeling for more lumps. And every time I get sick, every time I feel a lump, I'm worried that what's happened to so many of my friends is happening to me and that it's coming back. I think that people don't realize, too, that genetic damage gets passed on. So we're never going to see the end of this. I have a niece who was 35 when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Hers also was spread to her spine and her bones, and she's not going to make it. And she's got 3 little kids. But I think what really makes me sad is that most people in this country have no knowledge of this history. And the vast majority of downwinders across America will never know they are. I think, to me, that is a tragedy, but when those cancers can show up decades after exposure, nobody connects the dots. I mean, had we immediately gotten ill after those blasts, it would have been a national catastrophe and testing would have immediately ended. But if they show up 20, 30, 40 years later, we're invisible. I have spoken about this, I've written about it, I've lobbied in Congress for 40 years. Most of my life has been spent on this work. And I've talked to survivors across the country. I've met Benedict. I've met people all over the world who have similar stories, and they are always absolutely heartbreaking. And wherever they lived, their stories are of endless grief, loss, and suffering. So I think that, as you said, recounting our stories is incredibly painful, but we have an obligation to keep telling them. I think we were sacrificed in the name of nuclear deterrence. And when I feel that weight of sorrow and I want to just give it up, I always think of what my cousin told me. She said, your story didn't end tragically so that you can carry the tragic story forward. And I do feel an intense responsibility to do that and to let people know this is not the past. This is very much a part of our ongoing reality. We suffered and continue to suffer because of our government's recklessness, because of a government that knew from the beginning the lethal and lasting impacts of fallout, but conducted those tests anyway, and then lied, denied, and minimized and covered up the damage. We struggled for years for amends and justice. Radiation Compensation Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, was finally passed in 1990, but it was always far too limited. It only covered a handful of counties. And this last, I hate to call it beautiful, the big budget bill included, as the very last part of it, legislation that would add more counties, more states to RECA. Unfortunately, it still didn't go far enough. It was a win, and it's a win we didn't expect, but it did not go far enough. So there are still people dying. There are still people waiting for justice. And, I mean, is it justice? Whatever will make up for what we've lost and for all the loved ones we've buried. Nothing can make up for that. So this month, as we mark the anniversary of Trinity, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the specter of nuclear conflict has returned. It's resurfacing. I just think, have we learned nothing from our past? They're actually talking about resuming testing. They're building up the arsenals of our nuclear weapons. And that's why I think it's more critical than ever that the voices of those of us who have been affected are heard. Our insights, our perspectives are every bit as important as those of nuclear experts, think tanks, and our policymakers, because we know firsthand what those weapons did. We take them out of the realm of the abstract and make them intensely personal. I think they have to listen to what we have to say, because our lived experience is a powerful warning of what may be at stake for all of us. We can never again use those weapons. Never. They cannot be part of our future. We can't undo what's already happened, but we can learn from the tragedies of the past so that future generations are never again deemed expendable. And I know Daryl Kimball asked me a couple of weeks ago, what do you consider justice? And the ultimate justice is to bring the nuclear age to an end. We must abolish these weapons. I have to tell you, we all live downwind. We all live downwind.
Thank you, Mary, for that powerful testimony. As my colleague Seth Sheldon has said in the last couple of days we've been here in DC, deterrence is a theory, the harms are real. And every time a downwinder, a nuclear survivor, tells their story, they are reliving that trauma. And so the courage that it takes a piece of them every time they tell that story. The courage that it takes is incredible. That's why Nihon Hidankyo, representing the Hibakusha of Japan, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2024 for their courageous work, lifelong commitment to bringing those stories to life. And we have now another incredible nuclear survivor, Benetik, who will tell us the story of the impact of US nuclear testing on the Marshall Islands. There were 67 such explosions, and you will tell us about the impacts of those explosions. Thank you, Benetik. Yes.
Well, hello everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to share the profound legacy of nuclear weapons testing conducted by the United States in the Marshall Islands and the multifaceted impact it has had on the health, environment, culture, and economy of the Marshallese people. Nearly 8 decades ago, the US government selected the Marshall Islands as a primary testing site to develop what would become its nuclear arsenal, specifically designating Bikini Atoll in the northern part of the country and Enewetak Atoll in the far northwest as ground zero. This choice was made to shield the American public from exposure, despite the fact that it had tested Trinity, and on the basis that islander people on distant atolls were quote unquote savages and few in number, thus demonstrating a clear awareness on the part of U.S. officials regarding the catastrophic consequences nuclear testing could bring. In the years that followed, the effects of these tests became increasingly evident. The detonation of 67 known nuclear devices scattered radioactive materials across vast areas, resulting in severe long term health issues for the local population, including increased rates of cancer and other illnesses. The environmental repercussions were equally devastating, with ecosystems disrupted and traditional fishing grounds rendered unsafe, thus threatening the very means by which the Marshallese people sustained their livelihoods. Moreover, the cultural impact has been profound. Displacement from ancestral land has disconnected many Marshallese from their heritage and traditional practices, undermining community cohesion and identity. Economically, the long term ramifications of losing territory and resources, combined with the ongoing need for health care and support, have hindered the overall development of my country. Ultimately, the U.S. government's knowledge of the potential ramifications of nuclear testing underscores a troubling aspect of this history, suggesting that the impacts on both the land and its inhabitants were not mere collateral damage, but rather a predictable outcome of decisions made without adequate regard for the Marshallese people. This aspect is vital in acknowledging the complex legacy of nuclear colonialism and advocating for justice and recognition for all Marshallese. The nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands totaled 108 megatons, with about 55% of all U.S. nuclear tests occurring there. The most powerful test, Castle Bravo, was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It reached a peak altitude of 130,000 feet, with a cloud diameter of 62 miles, penetrating the stratosphere near the ozone layer. The Bravo test alone evaporated 3 islands at Bikini Atoll and created a mile-wide crater that is 250 feet below sea level. According to Marshallese elders, who were hundreds of miles away on different islands and atolls from ground zero, the earth beneath them shook. Bravo vaporized 10 million tons of white coral limestone, resulting in a light color fallout that affected every island in the Marshall Islands. The Marshallese who received heavy radioactive fallout experienced nausea, vomiting, skin burns, and lesions, ocular damage, and hair loss. Traces of this fallout were eventually found around the world, as far away as Mexico City, India, nations in Europe, and the United States, among others. In Japan, it was discovered that 20,000 fishermen were exposed to radiation from Castle Bravo. Again, a single nuclear test. In its aftermath, the United States only admitted the test occurred after the Japanese questioned the U.S. government. But the U.S. ignored Marshallese leaders who wrote to the United Nations pleading that the test end. Instead, my ancestral homelands became a scientific laboratory, and my people were literally treated like lab rats. Delayed evacuations and exploitative medical studies intensified the physical suffering of my people. Ultimately, the expansion of testing by the Soviet Union and the fear of radiation exposure by the U.S. public and elsewhere contributed to the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. But at that point, the damage to my homelands and ancestors was already done. Thyroid issues, cancer, leukemia, and birth defects continue to be widespread in the Marshall Islands today. A 2010 study estimated that 55% of cancers in the northern Marshall Islands are related to radiation exposure. However, this number is low. Despite the presence of U.S. medical programs, the Marshallese people face challenges in accessing cancer screening. Due to the lack of oncology centers and specialists in the Marshall Islands, many seek treatment elsewhere, primarily here in the United States. In 1986, our two countries signed the Compact of Free Association, a special agreement that was intended to keep the Marshall Islands under the thumb of the United States, when Marshallese leaders expressed their desire for national sovereignty. As part of the compact, which was just renewed 2 years ago, Marshallese people can travel to the U.S. without a visa. Many, like my family and so many others, left seeking access to education, healthcare, employment, and increasingly fleeing the effects of climate change. There are many misconceptions about this agreement. Many assume that Marshallese individuals who relocate automatically have access to free healthcare or receive payments for migrating, both of which are untrue. In reality, we had to fight for decades to have eligibility for public benefits restored, and most Marshallese migrants encounter significant barriers in education, employment, and healthcare access, all of which were reasons people migrated in the first place. In the latest iteration of the compact, the United States still does not take responsibility for the test or the damages they cause. Elected officials in Washington often are ignorant of the compact's existence, much less the history of testing in the Marshall Islands itself. For the Marshallese people, land represents our matrilineal heritage and is vital to our identity. Displacement has caused cultural disruption, leading to intergenerational trauma. Our elders describe an endless fallout, with birth defects, chronic illnesses, and a growing mistrust of U.S. medical professionals and culture. This connection from ancestral lands has harmed our health and eroded our historical bonds. Despite these challenges, many in our community are working to preserve our tradition and history for future generations, including myself in the organization that I lead, the Marshallese Educational Initiative. There is a lot to unravel from the Marshall Islands nuclear legacy, and what I have shared is only a small part of this ongoing misery for the Marshallese people and other communities impacted by these tests. We expect the U.S. to take full responsibility, officially apologize for its wrongdoings, and provide adequate support for victims' assistance and environmental remediation. The truth is that no amount of compensation can reverse the damage that has already been done. It will not bring back islands that were obliterated or the loved ones we have lost due to nuclear-related illnesses. Justice is not just financial. It is the right to reclaim our land, health, and cultural sovereignty. The experiences of my people, including communities impacted by the first nuclear weapons test in use, illuminate why these weapons of mass destruction must be destroyed, which is possible through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and why the idea that nuclear weapons ensure our safety is a fairy tale. Our experiences, however, are not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benedict. Very powerful testimony. Now, we have our third panelist, Arjun Makhjani. Arjun, you have a very tough job, but you are up to the task of describing in broad terms the scope and the scale of the health and environmental impact of US nuclear weapons production across the dozen major nuclear weapons complex sites and laboratories and dozens of smaller sites across the country, the challenges and long-term costs of remediating the damage going forward.
Thank you very much.
You,
I'm 80, so I hope I am up to the task. At least I'm old enough. Good to see you, Bill. So all of you know that this mess sort of started when Einstein wrote that letter to President Roosevelt saying, you know, do something. Basically saying, do something. The Nazis should not get the bomb first. And just to tell you where I am morally, I think I would have not had more wisdom than Einstein. And if I were here, I probably would have joined. But I've also said that I hope that I would have had the moral vision to quit when Joe Rotblat quit. December 1944. Why is that important in the context of talking about the health and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons production? Well, the Manhattan Project was huge. It was a huge engineering enterprise. You heard about the physicists at Los Alamos. But really, the nuclear weapons states that did atmospheric testing, estimated to cause hundreds of thousands of cancers globally, and I'll come to that in a bit, are sort of seen as the, muscular presence of the 20th and 21st century. When Henry Stimson briefed President Truman, who did not know about the Manhattan Project, even as vice president, about the bomb on the 25th of April, 1945. Thank you. He said, basically he told them how destructive it could all be in the world. They were very aware of it. But he also said that, and this is not an exact quote, but not far from it, that we can figure out the proper use of this weapon. We can control the peace of the world, and our civilization can be saved. A civilization that wants to control the peace of the world with nuclear weapons, it's an interesting concept, but wasn't new on April 25th, 1945. It actually arose at about the same time as Einstein wrote a letter saying, we need this for a kind of a deterrence, stop the Nazis from getting it first. But there was another gentleman who had a lot of company in this establishment in this town who thought at the end of the world, basically, the US should tell people what to do because presumably they believed it would be a benign power. In December 1944, early December, the United States knew that the Germans don't have a bomb. But the Japanese actually had been targeted a year and a half before, and Germany had been de-targeted. The scientists who were working on the bomb did not know that. That sort of, Joe Rothblatt came to know that Hitler doesn't have the bomb in early December because there was a spy mission. And he quit, but he was the only one who did. Why is that so important? And why do you not yet know about it, I would bet? The big plutonium factory was at that time near completion in Hanford, Washington. There are huge amounts of high-level radioactive waste sitting in tanks still, till today. They have leaked into the ground. I think 67 of them have leaked into the ground, 10 miles from the Columbia River, which is the largest river in the West, I believe, and very central to the existence of, people who live in the West. At that time, the plutonium separation plants had not yet begun to separate plutonium. The reactors had, I'm not exactly remembering the dates of the reactors, but I think the reactors had started in late 44. You might excuse it, I'm wrong about the date. But the plutonium had not been separated. So you irradiate uranium, and you put it into this giant remotely operated chemical plant, and you separate the plutonium, which is a small fraction of the irradiated uranium. And you create all of this highly radioactive waste because of fission products, which are much more radioactive than uranium and more radioactive than plutonium. So if Einstein's purpose was the purpose of the bomb, it would have been stopped. Nazis do not have the bomb, the war is getting over, the Russians are, coming in from the east toward Germany, the Americans and British and some French are coming in to Germany from the west, and it's all going to converge on Berlin pretty soon. There were some hiccups, known as the Battle of the Bulge, that was the biggest one. But basically, in 43, people know which side would win in the West, and in August 44, people knew the war that Japan would be defeated in the East when Saipan was captured. So at that point, Einstein's purpose was accomplished. If Einstein's purpose was the purpose of the bomb, we would not have all these highly radioactive wastes in the Columbia River. But the Manhattan Project was actually accelerated so that the bomb could be used in this war. That was the purpose of the project. And the guy who headed it scientifically was not Oppenheimer. He was the physicist in Los Alamos. The guy who headed it scientifically worked in the White House. His name was Vannevar Bush. How many have heard of him? A minority. Huh? From me, yes. Most of you may be from me. Maybe the most important scientist in the 20th century, certainly more important than Oppenheimer, who, in my opinion, and I shouldn't really say this because it really is an opinion, who, for me, could have done what Oppenheimer did. Probably the most brilliant practical physicist in the 20th century, on both sides, theoretical. So the idea of the bomb being used to tell people what to do after the war was integral in the minds of the people who ran the establishment here. There's plenty of documentation. I wrote an essay about it on the 79th anniversary about a year ago. And if you have some criticism of it, I would certainly welcome it and revise my opinion if I am wrong. But what I'm here to say, unfortunately, I can't show you pictures, but the uranium for the bomb, and it's in Einstein's letter drafted by Szilard. In the letter, he said, you know, the best, these are all paraphrases. The place for uranium is the Congo. The United States ores were 0.5%, 1%. Canadian ores may be a little bit better. But Congo uranium ores were 65% uranium. They were already being extracted, not for the uranium, but for the radium, which is a decay product, you know, the one paint dials and the watches, the luminous watches and the aircraft instruments. And the tragic story of the radium dial painters, whose bodies led to the first radiation protection from plutonium in the Manhattan Project, the measurements in their bodies. I would say that the most iconic country of the modern age, including the nuclear age, is Congo. That is where the uranium came from. It went to Canada. It was stored in New York. The wastes, the radioactivity from there is still around New York State. The first real harm, so although we're Trinity harm you've heard about already, the first real harm from nuclear weapons production in terms of tragic health effects happened in Iowa. That is where the process to make uranium metal, which were irradiated in order to make plutonium in Hanford, and then which was developed. And this is important, you take uranium fluoride and you make magnesium with it and you put it in a pot and you heat it. If you don't heat it exactly right, it will blow up on you. And it was done in a building without venting. It was, you know, a university building. And so this kind of blow up of these smelting pots happened sometimes a few times a week. I think sometimes it happened more than once a day. The larger casualties from uranium production were in the gateway to the West, St. Louis, Missouri, downtown St. Louis, Missouri. That's where, in my estimation, apart from the scientists who knew they would be irradiated at the reactor, which went critical in December 1942, those were, and then the Trinity test. So the plutonium waste, the Trinity waste, the Trinity test irradiation, all of that would not have occurred if the purpose was deterrence of the Nazis. But the purpose was what Stimson told Truman. At least that's what the history tells me. Now, the Marshall Islands you've already heard about, and thank you very much. I know we've met sort of online, but I've never heard you speak, so I really appreciate that. I've also studied the Marshall Islands a lot. To this date, Congo, of course, was under Belgian rule at the time. Nobody asked the Congolese. And even now, maybe the most tragic country in many ways amidst all the tragedies that are going on in the world. So you process the uranium, you create depleted uranium. You should see there are 500,000 tons of rusting depleted uranium cylinders in this country alone. Some of that is from power and some of that is from weapons. I won't have time to tell you about how power was sort of the fig leaf on the horror of the thermonuclear bomb. That's for another day. But in the United States alone, mostly so uranium production in the United States also started at the time for the bomb, and Canada also, although most of the Congolese uranium was processed after the war. The high radium was now a waste. It was stored 16 miles west of Cincinnati in silos that were called K65 silos. And that was eventually put into cement and now is a legacy for future Texans in Southwest Texas. At the same time, they wanted to know more about radiation. We know a lot more than they did then. Benedict has already talked about how the Marshallese were treated as human experimental subjects. One of the pillars of the radiation establishment, who did some actually interesting, good things, including a very important standard for worker protection from beryllium and radiation protection standards. Merrill Eisenbud, he said, we should do these experiments. We should measure the urine in the people of the Marshall Islands because they're closer to us than the mice, referring to the laboratory mice. That's pretty explicit in the minutes of the 1956 meeting. But before that, the United States had started to do human experiments on Americans. The common thing is vulnerable populations. Whether you look at indigenous people in Australia, whether you look at the Marshall Islands, whether you look at French Polynesia, whether you look at Kazakhstan, which you're going to hear about. I'm so happy to see you again. The vulnerable population. Pregnant women were given radioactive cereal. Children who were thought to be, quote unquote, mentally retarded. I met one of them. He didn't seem mentally retarded to me. He was perfectly coherent. I met him, of course, when he was a grown-up in the 1990s. And they were given radioactive cereal. Prisoners' testicles were irradiated to high levels in a prisons in Walla Walla, Washington. This all happened until, what would you get the last date for human radiation experiments was in the United States? 1972. Plutonium injections. When I heard about it in the early 1980s, so it's the physical legacy, about 400, 500,000 cancers we estimated with the international physicians, we being my institute, with the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, including the great doctor, Australian doctor Tilman Ruff. You must know him, a good friend. And all the people, there's a Worker Compensation Act, workers who got cancer producing nuclear weapons. Chemical exposure, much underrated. All the nuclear processing takes a lot of chemicals. There's a lot of chemical pollution. So besides the radioactivity, there's terrible chemical pollution. So including mercury, interestingly. Mercury is used in the lithium processing. Lithium goes to making tritium for the bombs. So, and of course, setting off the bomb in this country, the Stalin already got the message when Truman told him we've got something very special at the Potsdam meeting in July 45. Started his bomb project. That started the thermonuclear project. So one of the ways to make it graphic for you is what happens when when the Bravo bomb was exploded. It was a thermonuclear bomb, deuterium and tritium fuse, and they produce a very benign atom, helium. They also produce a lot of neutrons. Now, very energetic neutrons, which bang into nitrogen in the atmosphere, there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and produce tritium, which is oxidized, and it becomes radioactive water. So basically, during atmospheric testing, the nuclear powers were raining radioactive rain on the world. Most, of course, in the places of testing. Marshall Islands testing amounted to the explosive power amounted to one Hiroshima bomb every day for 20 years. That's the amount of explosive power in those 67 tests. More than 100 times the explosive power of the atmospheric tests in Nevada, which was deadly enough and has caused all these cancers and irradiation of children and thyroid cancers throughout the country. When thyroid exposure maps were published in this country, I wish I could show you some of these maps, but I'll send the slides and maybe you can put them up on your websites. The lower 48 United States, as if were an island. I had a friend once who thought that Alaska was an island because it was up there. And Canada did not exist. And a brilliant woman, but that's how she learned in school. Of course, when I talked to her, she knew Alaska was not an island. But in school, she thought Alaska was an island. Because up there, the United States was over here, Hawaii was over there, and there was nothing else. I called that planet America. But there was radiation in Canada, there was radiation in Mexico. The Bravo test produced, and I have the map here, I wish I could show you, produced a hotspot in Mexico City. It produced, the Castle series produced hotspot in Mexico City to the east of the Marshall Islands. And it produced a hotspot in Colombo, Sri Lanka. We know that because they had gum film, they had measurements set up all around the world during thermonuclear testing. I'll end pretty soon. The degree of damage that has been done is really, really exemplified by the people who have been who have been subjected to these radioactive and chemical wastes, who will be living with it from the Congo to the Navajo Nation, where there are 500 abandoned nuclear uranium mills. There are more than 200 million tons of mill tailings containing radium with a half-life of 1,600 years. But the parent radionuclide from which radium comes, and radium will be there so long as thorium-230 is there, the half-life of thorium-230 is 75,000 years. And we've got this stuff sitting around in plastic-lined basins, thinking, well, they're supposed to last for 1,000 years. Many are torn already, of course, because you're running tractors over them to lay them down. More than 200 million tons of uranium mining waste in this country, and then from the ancillary power that arose out of the whole mess all over the world. So I won't detail you with the numbers. There are plenty on our website, IER.org. But I'll just say this. The problem of reproductive impacts and intergenerational impacts, and I'll close on this, which in my mind in some ways is the most important problem, was recognized early on. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which was put in place to evaluate the effects of the bombings like of Dresden and Tokyo and so on, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sent a medical and scientific delegation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to Japan, to study the medical and health situation there, starting in September 45, and they published their report in 1947. And in that report, they said basically the women who were pregnant within 900 meters of ground zero, they lost their pregnancies, essentially everyone. Between 900 meters and 2 kilometers, a little over a mile and a quarter, there was very severe damage to the pregnancies. Between 2 and 3 kilometers, where the bomb impact was not as great, only 1/3 of the children were born supposedly normally. That is, no immediate visible effects. I want to read to you what the physicists and scientists at the University of California, my doctoral alma mater, said about testing in the and how deliberate this was. So they knew that there will be genetic damage from testing early on. They knew that the Nevada test site was unsuitable because Stafford Warren had said after the Trinity test, don't test within 150 miles of human habitation. And of course, St. George, Utah is within 150 miles. Bikini was unsuitable by that criterion because Rongelap is within 150 miles. So all the sites were unsuitable. The major Bikini as a site, Nevada as a site, was unsuitable. And then the entire Marshall Islands was considered unsuitable by meteorological surveys specific to the Marshall Islands in 1948. Okay, so here's what my alma mater, April 1960 California engineer editorial said. I'm done. This is the last thing I'm going to quote to you. They believed that testing would, quote, increase genetic and pathological damage, and that it has so far, that is to 1960, produced about an additional 6,000 babies born with major defects worldwide. I mean, this was the science prevailing at the time. I've read the underlying science. Linus Pauling actually wrote an article in Science with these kinds of numbers, of course, opposing testing. And then they said, whether you choose to look at 1 part in 5,000 risk of major birth defects, or 6,000 babies born with major birth defects worldwide, you must weigh this acknowledged risk with the demonstrated need of the United States for a nuclear arsenal. So the United States have arrogated it to itself the right to damage children all over the world who might be on the receiving end of their nuclear weapons in order for the demonstrated, which to my mind scientifically was not demonstrated at all. This is in reference to the Korean War, that we should maybe think about using nuclear weapons in wars like that, because we didn't quite win that one. Although nuclear weapons could not be used during that war, and they didn't quite win that one, maybe because the Soviets already had nuclear weapons. It's hard to know whether the moral presumption, the physical damage, the political presumption, which is worse. But we are still living with the legacy of all of that in the world. The 5 members of the Security Council who are supposed to look after the safety and peace of the world are all responsible for nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere and the kind of damage I have tried to convey to you with some vignettes today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun, for that rich knowledge that you've brought to us today. I'm sure we would all be very interested in hearing a lot more, but for time restrictions. And you did refer to Joseph Rotblat, who of course was the only early nuclear scientist on the Manhattan Project to leave for moral reasons, and later became a nuclear disarmament activist and won the Nobel Peace Prize. But I mean, he said about deterrence that it is the ultimate form of terrorism. And I mean, he's right. So now we have time for questions from the audience. So we'll just wait and see. I might. Thanks. Okay. All right. One question we have from the audience is, have any of you met with proponents for resuming nuclear tests? If so, what was their reaction to your stories and advocacy? If not, how can we reach them with your devastating experiences? So, start with you, Mary.
I guess. I mean, we've met with a lot of people in Congress, many of them, I'm sure, wanting to resume nuclear testings. I think it's absolutely urgent they see our faces, hear our voices, and know they're real human beings who will suffer from these weapons. Interestingly, Trump has said that we shouldn't have nuclear weapons. But who knows? He says many things and then forgets. I think it's really hard to get through with them. I've had them tell me, well, we have to use these weapons because they have these weapons. And there's a horrible price to be paid for deterrence. Deterrence does not really work. There's just, the price is far, far too high. And we do try to tell them that. And I think sometimes it gets through to their staffers. I'm not sure it gets through to them, because to them, I think it's all still very abstract. And we just try to remind them, this is a very human consequence. So we try. I think they have to hear from many, many people, though. They just have to hear from their constituents. What was it Cory Booker said? The power of the people is greater than the people in power. So I think we just keep pushing.
Yeah. Question for Benedict. Unless, do either of you want to respond to that first question or go on to the other questions? All right. Benedict, how could the compact be changed and improved, and what would the process for that be? Congressional approval?
Well, thank you. So unfortunately, the compact, I mean, it has already been negotiated. That happened, I think, between 2020 and the year 2023. And we did bring up so many issues, ongoing issues that have yet to be addressed pertaining to the nuclear legacy. And despite discussions with the US government at the time, the compact that we have now obviously doesn't address the nuclear legacy. For me, I don't think I see the compact as a form of compensation, as a way to right the wrongs of the past. If anything, it's an obstacle to nuclear legacy. There's actually an espousal clause in Section 177 of the compact that prevents communities from Bikini Atoll and Niuetak and two other areas in the Marshall Islands from pursuing nuclear compensation from the U.S. And so I think for us, it's right now, instead of just focusing on pursuing nuclear justice bilaterally, which is what we've been doing for decades, it's pursuing nuclear justice at the international level. And that is what we are doing at the Human Rights Council with the support of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the next session, I believe, on this current report that they're working on will be next year in the fall at the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. And of course, there is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is the first international framework to provide for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And you and your colleagues have certainly been very active in seeking justice through that treaty. Now, Arjun, we have a question about the extent geographically of the main US nuclear weapons production sites around the US and the dozens of minor sites. Of course, you referred to Hanford in Washington State, and I believe the EPA has described that as the most toxic place in America. And you talked about the underground steel containers containing millions of tons of high-level radioactive nuclear waste, which is leaking now into the Columbia River. And I understand the cleanup bill for Hanford is already over $800 billion and they still haven't cleaned it up. And that's just one site across the states. So can you tell us about that?
Well, it'll be hard to give you a full tour, but but the big sites during the Manhattan Project were, of course, Hanford, Los Alamos, which is also contaminated, Oak Ridge, and then there were sites where the uranium was stored and processed. I alluded to them: New York, Canada, Ohio. So there's a big uranium metal factory built after the war in Ohio, 16 miles west of Cincinnati. It was called the Feed Materials Production Center, and that's where the radium was processed into cement eventually. It was shut down in 1989. There is, of course, a nuclear weapons assembly and disassembly plant in the panhandle of Texas, near Amarillo. And I have spoken to the farmer couple whose land goes right up to the boundary of the Pentex plant. And the reason I know these farmers is they were very worried about their groundwater. This is above the Ogallala Aquifer, the largest aquifer in the United States. They used to burn depleted uranium, which is basically a surplus of waste material used in bombs. But once the bombs are dismantled, it's not very valuable. They can just get new depleted uranium pretty cheaply. So then there are the other enrichment sites that were built, Portsmouth, Ohio, on the Ohio River in Ohio. And then Paducah, Kentucky is the other enrichment site. During the 1950s, I'll give you a small example. Daryl is here, so it's a personal example with Daryl. During the 1950s, everybody wanted into the uranium business. Nuclear business was seen as the future. And this very large factory that made uranium metal for the reactors in the Savannah River site in South Carolina and Hanford used to subcontract a small, and one of the subcontractors was in Daryl's hometown, and I went there and spoke there during the cleanup time some decades later. And it was basically, the processing was done, the machining of uranium was done in basically a shed without even a chimney, venting out through windows into people's backyards where children were playing. And then later on, was it canned food, Daryl, that was stored in these places? People forgot about it. And there were several hundred sites like this throughout the country that were contaminated. Long Island had some quite prominent sites I've been to, and a book was published during the Clinton administration under the Secretary O'Leary that kind of had a pretty good survey of a lot of these sites. You can never really completely clean them up. Cleanup is kind of a misnomer. Some remediation is possible, but the radioactivity is basically forever. But that's a story for another day. That gives you a little bit of a tour.
Thank you very much.
Livermore Lab, of course. There's Sandia Lab, 2 of them. There's so many places.
Thank you. So Mary, we have a few questions around the RECA bill. With the extension of RECA only 2 years from now, what should we do today to further expand and extend compensation? And RECA, even if a partial victory, is one of the few policy victories we've seen recently in the US. What lessons can we learn to apply to further fighting for RECA and on other issues?
First of all, never give up. We've been at it 30 years, and we didn't think it would actually happen, so never, ever give up. You just have to keep pushing. I think the best thing to do, I know people probably think I'm ungrateful for what we got. I mean, my family's now covered. I'm covered. But 2 years isn't a very long time when you have to go through an onerous process of documentation. You have to document where you lived at the specified times. And when you were a child then, it's really hard to produce receipts. You have to prove that what disease you had and have your medical records. I don't still have mine. I hope they have them somewhere in my hospital. But I think the best thing to do is just to let people know in Congress that it's not over. That work's not finished. There are still far too many communities that were left out. The Ohio site's not included. There were a few sites, Kentucky, Tennessee, but not enough were included. And for states, only all of Utah, all of Idaho, and all of New Mexico were included. The other states where people worked so hard were not. I think we just have to keep pushing. We have to say, it's not over. I think it's going to be very easy for them to think, oh, we took care of them, they'll go away. Well, I had a friend, and unfortunately he's gone, but he always said, they're just waiting for all of us to die. And, you know, when you look at the ages that you had to be covered, we're all getting there. So I say push hard, let them know that was a great thing you did. That was great progress, but it did not go far enough. I think that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Mary. And of course, nuclear survivors are the true experts on the reality of nuclear weapons, what nuclear weapons actually do to people and to the environment. Benedict, the Runit Dome on Enuet Atoll, which is where the US stored like 35 Olympic swimming pools worth of nuclear waste in a crater from a previous nuclear explosion, covered it over with a concrete dome in the 70s. That concrete dome is cracking, and with sea level rising, with climate change, it's leaking into the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that's just, it's a symbol of, you know, everything that's wrong with this issue, and it shows the interconnectedness of all of these different issues, whether you're talking about colonialism and racism, the impact on the environment, on health, on human rights, on food security. Can you talk to us a bit about those interconnections and the Marshallese experience of that?
So the Runit Dome, actually, it was back in December of 2019 that Congress instructed the U.S. Department of Energy to assess the situation at the Runit Dome, because for years, for decades, the Marshallese government, the Marshallese people have been trying to say that it's leaking. This nuclear debris, as you mentioned, it's about the size of 35 Olympic-sized swimming pools. But what's contained in the Runit Dome is only 1% of the total nuclear debris that's in the Marshall Islands. And there are many reasons why it was put that way. But one is, you know, to make it seem like they really cleaned up the Marshall Islands. But there's actually a community on Enuet Atoll. They were told by the US government that it was safe for them to return. Despite the fact that it's a former test site. And people are sick, they have cancer, diabetes, heart disease, so many health issues. And they were told not to eat what is grown on the land or from the ocean. Now, imagine a community that depends on food that's imported from the outside world. And it takes weeks, if not months, for that food to actually be shipped to this community. And so what happens when that food takes long for them to receive? They have no other choice but to eat what's grown on the land or from the ocean. And, you know, that's the reality of this community on Enuet and many other communities in the Marshall Islands. That's why we say this nuclear legacy has yet to be addressed.
The Runit Dome was part of a cleanup of part of Marshall Islands that were oriented only to, primarily to plutonium. Some of that plutonium was collected, a very large amount of waste was put in there. The Runit Dome, the waste was put into a bomb crater. And the bomb crater was not lined. So this is already a completely fractured environment, and the waste was put in there. So it was in communication with the ocean from the very beginning, before the cracks and on the top. So that communication of radioactivity with the ocean was going on from the time the Runit Dome was built. There were two other plutonium. So most of the plutonium is in the lagoon. There's some plutonium where in Eniwetok where people are living, as Bentic said. But there were two accidents in the 1960s with nuclear weapons. You probably have heard of them. Palomares, a village in Spain, where plutonium got scattered from an aircraft accident that was carrying bombs. And the same happened in Tula, Greenland, a place much in the news these days. And plutonium got scattered over there. In both those places, the majority of the plutonium that was collected was sent back to the nuclear weapon sites in the United States, Savannah River site in South Carolina, which, by the way, is still leaking tritium into the Savannah River. People in Hilton Head may not know that they are drinking tritium-contaminated water. It's below the drinking water standard by quite a bit, but I don't agree that the drinking water standard is a good standard. In the case of the Runit Dome, the Nevada Operations Office, if I'm remembering correctly, and the Marshallese said, why don't you take this back to the United States? And they were refused. In contrast to what they had done in Greenland, which was in cooperation with the government of Denmark and the government of Spain. So I just wanted to make that note. And you're right, most of the radioactivity, the coconut crabs will be affected by strontium-90. They were not the object of the cleanup at all.
Thank you, Arjun. Now, I think we've just got time for perhaps just this one final question. And I'll direct this to Mary and Benetik. For people who do not have your lived experience, how do we best communicate with the general public to raise awareness without co-opting your stories?
Well, number one, I think you amplify our stories. You keep telling them. I don't think you have to have lived it to fight it, but I do think it helps to share the stories, amplify them, just keep telling them. I have copies of that map and little ones you can put in your wallet. I carry mine in my wallet. I show it everywhere I go because I think it speaks volumes about what happened.
I would have to say the same thing. I often tell people that the only thing we have is our voices, something that our elders, ancestors were prevented from using during the nuclear testing program. And it's not easy talking about these issues. They are lived experiences. I have lost countless family members to cancer and other nuclear-related illnesses. And 3 of my grandparents, one passed away in 2020, another 2 years later, and another the following year. All from either cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and the one that is still with us today, she's actually from Bikini Atoll. She turned 81 3 months ago, has not set foot on her homeland. But she's actually, right now I should be with her, next to her. She's actually supposed to go in for surgery next week for a brain tumor. And so that's one of the things that we have to deal with, is trying to balance this work, but also making sure that we have time with our loved ones. especially those who are older and who lived during that time. Um, and oftentimes people ask me, how do you deal with this trauma? This is how I deal with it. I retell the story over and over again because my grandmother is not going to do that. The older generation, they're not going to do that. And so this obligation has fallen on me and my generation. And so I think, yeah, like Mary said, that's the only way is to retell the story, make those connections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please thank our panel.